Hi everyone. My name is Steve Bosworth. I'm a front-end developer here at Shopify on the themes team. And what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is web accessibility and how it relates to themes on Shopify, and some tools and practices that you can roll into your own workflows to make your themes a lot more accessible. I'm going to be sort of touching on a lot of things today, really like brief overview of a lot of things. So don't worry, I'm going to share the slides afterwards, along with a lot of resources and links to some of the things that I might just mention, so you don't have to frantically take notes or anything like that. But just getting right into it, what is accessibility, or A11Y? If you're not familiar with accessibility, you might have seen this abbreviation around the web. It's just accessibility with the 11 middle letters stripped out of it. Makes it a little bit easier to hashtag, and you can pronounce it sort of any way you like. But accessibility on the web really means, through our designs and our codes, making the content of our stores accessible to everyone, regardless of whether or not they have some sort of physical disability. So from a code perspective, basically, HTML is sort of the bedrock of accessibility on the web. If you let it, it does a lot of the work for you. So using semantic markup where it's appropriate, using descriptive tags to indicate what type of content lives in that tag. So heading tags, having alt attributes on your images, stuff like that. So the real easy thing is that all you have to do is not break the web, and it's a lot easier than it sounds. JS and CSS will also have a lot to do with your accessibility, but it all comes back to HTML at the end of the day. In practice, what accessibility means, at least for our team, is generally just asking ourselves a lot of questions while we're developing a theme. So, what happens when I hit tab on my keyboard? Am I still able to navigate my site? What happens if I turn on a screen reader or use some other type of assistive device to try and navigate a store? Or even, from a design level, what happens if you take away all of the colors, totally monochrome? Can you still see what's important? Can you still see what elements you should be interacting with or what state they're in? So, similar to our responsive workflow, and I really like to think of accessibility as just a workflow that sits alongside your responsive workflow. There you're asking questions. What does it look like when my theme is on a mobile device or on, when I use a touch instead of a click to interact with an element? That's just, how does our content look on devices? Accessibility is a workflow that lets you think about what your content looks like to your users. So I think it's a really powerful that way. Let's just talk briefly about the W3C, because you can't really talk about accessibility without talking about them. Just like HTML and CSS have a spec, accessibility on the web has the WCAG 2.0, which is the spec for building accessible websites and web apps. Additionally, a lot of Shopify merchants will actually live in jurisdictions that might have some sort of legal requirements for how accessible their businesses have to be. And the great thing is that by coding your themes to be compliant with the WCAG 2.0, for the most part, you're going to be building them to also be compliant with the laws of those jurisdictions. Of course, you should do more research about this if this impacts any sort of client work you're doing, or if you're building themes for the theme store. So what are we going to be talking about today with accessibility in Shopify? My goal is really to get you excited and passionate about learning about accessibility and implementing it in your own workflows, and show you some sort of concrete examples that we've come across in our team and problems that we've solved, so you have some tools that you can take with you today to get started in your workflows. Me personally, when I started working on accessibility on Shopify themes, I suddenly found that I was just becoming super passionate about it. It's a really interesting way to start looking at your content and your designs and your own workflows and how you can make them better to suit wider audiences, which is really what the goal is. So, we all have that friend that does CrossFit, and you don't really have to wait for them to start talking about CrossFit. So I'm hoping to turn you into accessibility CrossFitters, if you will. So who's everyone? At Shopify, our mission statement and something we're always driving towards is making commerce better for everyone. Our themes, as we've seen today across a lot of the talks, our online storefronts are still the primary way that a lot of customers are interacting with our merchants and their brands. So we want to empower them to set their best foot forward with all of their users, not just a subset of them. So when we're talking about who everyone is, from a customer's perspective, these are just sort of some sort of rough statistics of accessibility or of disabilities in the United States. Vision problems and color blindness are sort of the quintessential ones that people think about when they think about accessibility in web design. Physical functioning, so an ability to use an input device like a mouse versus some users who are only able to use something like a keyboard or a different assistive technology. And then hearing difficulty doesn't come up as much on the web, but with the rise of video and that being more prominent content on a lot of storefronts, we want to make sure that if there's not closed captioning for those videos, that users with visual disabilities will be able to understand that content. So you might be thinking like, oh, that's a lot of work. Those numbers aren't that high. Here it's, I have 10 browsers and 40 devices I'm already testing against. Is this like another thing that's going to delay me putting out my themes or building that killer feature that I really, really want to do that, whizzes content across the screen and then, disappears it into a different, and like it pops up 4 modals. But the thing about accessibility is to understand is that, they vary, in degree, so it's actually a very wide range of people will experience a disability, and they can affect anyone at any time. For instance, if you fall and break your wrist, you might be stuck using a keyboard as your primary input method for a month, and all of a sudden, keyboard accessibility is going to become really important for you. Everyone's had the experience of standing outside, squinting at their phone in the sunlight, and all of a sudden, color contrast and text settings are going to be really important to you in that moment. So when we're talking about accessibilities or disabilities, we're not just talking about a small subset of people who live with this in their everyday life all the time. It's actually a much broader population that includes everyone at some point in their life. So the other thing I like to talk about when people say, oh, I don't have time for accessibility is, we looked at all those statistics. IE8 is only 2.69% of global browser usage. When we look at Shopify storefronts in particular, that's actually less than 1%. So, how much time have you spent as a front-end developer struggling to put border radiuses on a button in IE8 or messing around with opacities and animations? You can use that time much more effectively to reach a much wider audience by taking accessibility into account in your workflows. So, when we say everyone, we mean everyone, and I really just wanted to put Gary Oldman huge up on the screen there because I love that GIF. But yeah, moving into the nuts and bolts, how do you work this stuff into your workflow when you're building themes on Shopify? The most important thing, is to make sure that you're actually testing the things that you're doing. The same way that you wouldn't code up, the mobile viewport of a theme and just, throw a bunch of stuff in some media queries, ship it, and say like, yeah, it works. It's fine. I don't have to check devices. You want to be iterating and making sure that the things that you think are working are actually working. So we'll go a little bit into the various ways that you can start testing accessibility on your theme. And the first is the keyboard. This is something you want to integrate into your daily development workflow. Not just with a screen reader on, because keyboards will actually behave differently depending on whether a screen reader's on or off. But when you're taking that time in a browser to make sure that that click event handler that you just put on that button to pop up a modal works, take another few minutes and go through your browsers and make sure that you can actually tab to that button and you can activate that modal, interact with the content, or escape out of it, all without touching the mouse. This is a really sort of low-cost, really easy way to integrate accessibility into your testing. The next is screen readers. So if you haven't done a lot of accessibility work already, in your themes and you've never used a screen reader, I'm just going to play a really quick video here. This is the Mac OS X voiceover screen reader tool. It's built into every Mac. And some things to watch out for when we're watching this video is just what happens when we get to the cart icon up in the header there, and what happens at the pricing when we get to that as well. As well, there's a black bar that'll show up that's just a textual representation of whatever it is that the screen reader is reading. So we'll just watch this video really quick.
Voiceover on Chrome, Duckworth Wolfville Jacket, Brooklyn theme, window, Duckworth Wolfville Jacket, Brooklyn theme, HTML content has keyboard focus. Duckworth Wolfville Jacket, Brooklyn theme, HTML content. Duckworth Wolfville Jacket, Brooklyn theme, visited, link, image, Brooklyn, list 6 items. UARC, visited, link, MENS, link, women's, link, bags, link, home, link, outdoor, collapsed, link, cart. End of list. End of banner. Main 10 items. Duckworth Wolfville, man wearing Duckworth Wolfville Jacket, image. Woman holding axe, image. Heading level 1, Duckworth Wolfville Jacket. Regular price $218, sale price $188. Color. Harvest, selected, navy, radio button. Size. S, selected, radio.
OK, cool. And it goes on. The really cool thing is if you've never seen a screen reader or a user who uses a screen reader in their day-to-day workflow, that voice is actually slowed way down. So the speech rate of someone who uses a screen reader every day is just going to be like super rapid fire. And it's incredible to watch these people interact with your content. So the sort of 3 main screen readers that are available and used out in the world are Apple VoiceOver, which is on OS X and built into iOS as well. JAWS and NVDA are both available on Windows. JAWS is a commercial product, and the license is actually pretty expensive. So a lot of people are switching to NVDA, which is an open source alternative and free. And it actually works a little bit better with web content than JAWS does even. The other thing to know about screen readers is you want to make sure that you're actually testing with screen readers in the browser that they were designed for. So Apple VoiceOver works best with Safari. If you start testing it in Chrome, you'll start running into some really weird behaviors that users in the real world wouldn't encounter. So it's just kind of like a black hole of fixing bugs that don't exist. So make sure you're pairing up each of these browsers with the browser they're intended to be used with. Next is automated tools. This is definitely a favorite of developers because we love to automate things. This means we get to use things like Grunt and Gulp, open our browser tools. But the thing to remember about these is that they're best treated similar to linters, which you might be using for JavaScript and CSS. They'll catch a lot of generic bugs and catch things early in your development process, but they're definitely not a replacement for doing actual testing yourself. So you just want to keep that in mind if you're considering bringing these into your workflow. The next one is user testing. I like to think of it as the holy grail of accessibility testing because you aren't using these technologies necessarily day to day. You don't have the experience of using a screen reader or keyboard accessibility across all of the sites on the internet. So bringing in a user who actually deals with these things day to day and interacts with contents using these accessibility technologies day to day can really open your eyes. A lot of the examples that I'm going to be showing later on are actually the result, bugs that we found in our themes as a result of doing user testing ourselves. So it's a really good resource. So let's get a little bit into themes themselves and some examples of how you can be targeting some sort of really high impact areas in your theme for accessibility and improving on those. We'll go into each of these in depth, and we might as well just jump right into it. So the first thing is alt texts on images and icons. So any graphical element on your page, you want to make sure that you're providing a text fallback for it. So any user that's using a screen reader is going to have that content announced to them, and they won't just see like an image tag with some weird URL to JPEG. The nice thing about Shopify is that we actually get in themes access to a lot of these alt texts generated for us For instance, products and collection images will have an alt text automatically generated for them. The other thing to know about alt texts when you're generating that alt tag is that you want it to visually describe what's in the image, but you also want it to be contextual. So for instance, here we have blue dock shoes, but we could also visually describe this by saying the alt text is 2 shoes, laces tied with brown soles. But if a user comes across that using their screen reader, they're not necessarily going to understand what the purpose of that image is. So here we're just using the product title, which does a really good job of describing what that image is and its role on the page. The other thing that we deal with as theme developers that's sort of specific to Shopify are any images that we might be uploading through our theme settings. Slideshows are a really good example of this. And here we have the Brooklyn slideshow. And you can see highlighted there the alt text that we've generated when this is an actual image is just using the slide heading setting. We decided to do this because this is something just adding in an alt text setting underneath an image, merchants might not understand what the role of that setting is, so they might not be providing the best information possible. So we decided to default to something that's going to be more contextual. But if you do have an image that you're uploading through your theme settings, and you don't have a setting that you can use to generate that contextual alt text, just add in an alt text setting underneath the image, and you'll be good to go. So the last graphical thing to talk about is definitely icons. They're used in all our themes, and we've recently switched to SVG icons in our themes, but font icons provide the same challenges to screen readers. You saw when it announced on that video, it got to the cart icon and it said cart. It didn't say that because there was anything in the SVG element that the screen reader could understand. We actually had to hide that from the screen reader and then provide a second span here that gives that fallback text. And just for anyone who might be submitting themes to the theme store, this is the sort of thing that you would definitely want to internationalize. So we do that in all our themes, but I've just kind of simplified it here for the examples. The next thing is forms. So I include also this is like a catch-all for any interactive elements that you might have on your theme. Forms are the main ones on Shopify themes, but also navigation would apply here. The reason that you want to focus on forms as a really high-impact area for accessibility is because we're not just asking users to passively consume our content. The goal of a Shopify store and an online store is to get someone to click that add to cart button and actually check out and buy some products. So we're really asking the users to interact with our content. So here we have 2 examples. It's the same form on Brooklyn. On the left, we have the error states, and on the right, the success state. And so you can see here, like the right is actually a really good example for the success state. That you don't want to just be using color to indicate whether it's a success or a failure state. It's kind of washed out there. It's hard to tell if it's green, but we're actually giving a message your comment was posted successfully. The other thing you want to be doing on your forms is make sure, again, this goes back to making sure that our HTML is semantic. We're adding labels, even if we're not visually showing them. We're adding labels to all of our inputs, and you'll see that on the next slide. And then finally, with the error states, we're actually providing a textual clue as to where the error is on this form. It says email is invalid. We're not just relying on that red border around the email input for the user to find out where the error is. Because if they don't know where the error is, they're much more likely to just close the tab and forget that they ever wanted to post a comment or even add to cart. So here you can see with the forms available in Shopify, we get a form.errors liquid object back that we can use to display any errors or success messages. It's a separate object, but you can display those error and success states using a liquid object. You can see there we have highlighted the label as well, which we're not visually showing, but it's still there. And then finally, you can actually drill down into the form.errors liquid object to visually indicate which inputs might have error states on them. So next is tables, and no one who does front-end development really likes to talk about tables. We'd all rather forget that we ever did layouts with tables and just use divs and spans and CSS and just pretend they never happened, because there's a lot of weird CSS rules when you're trying to make things really visually pop that you have to override on tables, and they're frustrating. But this really goes back to the point that we need to make sure that we're using HTML properly in order to make our themes accessible. For instance, here, if this was all in divs and spans in the desktop view, the screen reader would have no idea how to tie the pieces of content together and say that, like this product is actually part of this row, and this table cell falls under this heading. So it becomes really difficult to navigate as a user using a screen reader or even a keyboard. The problem is that, tables are really hard on mobile because we don't have that nice wide desktop viewport. We can't really do columns and rows. We need to squish everything down into a single column. And we've actually found a really neat way of doing this. What we do here is we just visually hide our header, so it's still announced by the screen reader, and then we add in labels for visual users using CSS by itself to pull out that data label attribute and visually present it to the users, but it's usually not going to be announced by the screen reader. So this table is still totally accessible, but we can really drastically change the visual layout, which is awesome. Finally, we get to pricing. This was actually a really interesting thing that came out of our user testing, like I mentioned before. Pricing is one of those things that really varies widely across themes. Here we have 4 different examples. Within the center, it's sort of like the platonic price of just like $45 decimal 2 zeros. And then we have, like Brooklyn up in the top, Supply, and Boundless, and they all handled prices just a little bit differently. And we thought we were doing really well because, we were visually showing, we weren't relying just on color to indicate sale state. We had a strike through, so a colorblind user would still understand that, $100 is the regular price in this Brooklyn example, and, the sale price is $188. We thought we were doing awesome until we got into user testing. So this is sort of a really common pattern where we'll move our sense up into a superscript, so it looks really nice and it visually ties in with some branding in the store and just kind of makes that price pop and look really visually appealing. The problem is when we move prices, especially into separate HTML tags, screen readers don't understand what the relation of those 2 numbers are anymore. So our screen readers started announcing this as 45499. And you'd hope that that's the price, but you don't actually know what that number is. And it could be $454.99, or it could be $45,499. One of them I'd be happy to pay for a camera, the other one not so much. And the important thing is here that we don't want to make users work to understand our content. We want to lay it out in a way that they're going to understand and really reduce that friction to understand the content and move to that checkout process. So what we've done on Supply is adopted a pattern similar to what we do with icons, where we're just hiding the price with the subtag from the screen reader, and then visually hiding the real price and announcing it to the screen reader. So that you can see here in the black bar that it's a much more accessible format for screen readers to understand. Another common problem or pattern that we've implemented with our pricing, you can see here with Brooklyn. Because we don't actually need to reformat the prices, we're not moving them into separate subtags or doing anything weird with the HTML, but we are relying on some visual cues to indicate that one is the regular price and one is the sale price. For instance, when a screen reader reads prices on Brooklyn's before we did our user testing, it would just say $100, $50. And you don't know which price you're actually paying. and or maybe one price is for one variant and the other price is for another. If you don't have those visual cues, it's very hard to understand. So all we've done here is actually just add in again a visually hidden span, which announces either regular price and then sale price, and that's been a really good pattern for us across a couple of our themes. Finally, getting into color, contrast, and text. This is sort of an interesting one to talk about in relation to themes, because we're putting these things into theme settings and allowing merchants to edit these things. We can't actually guarantee that once we put our themes out into the wild, that these things are going to stay accessible. But I think we've encountered this on our team, that it's a really good way to start getting this dialogue going between designers and developers about accessibility, as well as in our presets, setting merchants up on the right foot when they're getting their stores ready for launch. So here we have Venture, which is a theme we recently released. On the left, we have the original design with the yellow header in the slideshow, and on the right, we have the updated design that we put out on launch. And what we realized when we started doing some contrast testing on our theme is that white text on a yellow background is actually very inaccessible. You can imagine looking at this on your phone out in the sun. It's probably the worst color pairing you could have to have like that live without limits text really pop. So Maxim, one of our designers, actually had to go back and redo the whole preset and change all of the colors on it. It was a really painful process, but at the end of the day, he came back with this really great new color contrast, or accessible color contrast. And it's something that he said, it was painful the first time he did it, but every time he's gone in to look at his presets and do his designs, he has this in the back of his head now, I should be checking color contrast as I'm designing. And you can start catching these problems a lot earlier in your workflow. So I've talked a lot about some really specific things that you can do in order to make your themes more accessible. But what can you do generally going forward? The best thing you can do is start talking about accessibility. There's tons of people on Twitter. Hashtag Ally or Ally is a really great way to start. There's tons of blog content to start diving into. But also, talk with your coworkers and discuss this with other developers and designers and project managers and even clients. And some things to keep in mind as you start rolling these things into your workflow is that accessibility is a process. You're very unlikely to reach that state of accessible, and each design is going to require specific solutions to accessibility problems. So it's something you want to work into your workflow and be making small iterations and testing those assumptions that you're making. Global usability is our goal. We want to make our themes better for everyone so that everyone can hit that add to cart button and our merchants make a lot of money. And finally, that accessibility is everyone's job. It's not just the developer's responsibility. You also want to talk to designers. You also want to talk to clients because they're generating a lot of the content on their sites. And you want to just talk to everyone about it. So that's sort of it for me. I'm going to be around for office hours tomorrow. You can grab me at the after party or in the hallways or whatever if you have any questions about theme development in general, accessibility in particular. I actually have about 10 minutes, so I can open it up to questions if anyone has any questions. And you can clap. I think someone has mics to run around. Are there any questions? Or yeah. In the theme store. Yeah, so the question is whether or not accessible themes are tagged or promoted in the theme store. Currently, we don't have that in the theme store. It's something we're looking at doing in the future, but it's something that we're doing audits on accessibility on all of the themes that we build at Shopify, and additionally, people who have launched themes in the theme store are looking to will know that we're actually doing reviews on accessibility for third-party themes available in the theme store as well. Yeah. I think there was a question over here.
Yeah, this isn't so much a question, but you
Yeah.
talked about colorblindness.
Yeah.
There's a great app that you should check out called End Developer. Super cool. It'll actually like overlay a window and show you what different users would see with different types of color blindness. So that's a super helpful utility.
Yeah, definitely. That was just a comment. There's for testing color blindness, there's actually an app. There's one I use on OS X. I can't remember the name of it, but I'll post a link in the slides. So you can actually simulate different types of color blindness on your own monitor. And it's actually kind of fun because if you ever turn one on and realize that nothing changed, it means that you have that type of color blindness. So you can actually test yourself too. Yeah. Are there any other questions? All right, cool. Thanks so much, guys.